In this lecture, covering the chapters from Ridley's The Origin of Virtue, we're going to look at arguments that rational egoism will produce cooperative behaviors. And we'll look at two converging lines of research that Ridley discusses: research in biology and animal behavior, and research in game theory, mathematics, and computer science. So we'll start off by talking about the development of game theory and the discovery of this strategy, tit for tat, that embodies a cooperative reciprocity approach to interactions. We'll spend a little time discussing one particular game, one simplified version of the world that theorists use to study choice and strategies in game theory, called the prisoner's dilemma. We'll talk about different ways in which theorists have looked at the prisoner's dilemma. Originally, theorists studied the prisoner's dilemma as a single iteration of a choice game. Later, they started looking at it through multiple iterations. So what will happen if you play that prisoner's dilemma game once, and then knowing what happened the first time, you then play it again with the same people, and again and again and again. So we'll look at single versus iterated versions of the prisoner's dilemma. And what we'll discover is that in iterated versions of the prisoner's dilemma, one strategy emerged, a strategy that embodies what's called reciprocity or conditional cooperation as a successful strategy for playing this game to achieve the best results. That's sort of how things develop in game theory, mathematics, computer science. But what about biology? Well, what we'll see is that researchers in biology start to look at whether or not evolution actually selected for behaviors that resembled tit for tat. And we'll look at a number of examples that biologists have found of animal behavior that looks remarkably like the strategy of tit for tat. So we'll look at the reciprocity behavior between female vampire bats when they share blood. We'll look at reciprocity in African vervet monkeys. I'll mention also reciprocity in olive baboons. And then we'll look at reciprocity in reef cleaning animals in the ocean. Then we'll note that while tit for tat or reciprocity or conditional cooperation can be a successful strategy in interactions with other creatures, it does have a cost benefit. In order to engage in reciprocity, you actually have to have a relatively large brain size. You have to be able to identify, recognize, remember individuals, and you have to be able to remember their histories and then act accordingly. And so reciprocity oftentimes is going to have this cost-benefit analysis that it will benefit you, but it will require that you have relatively large brain size if you're interacting regularly in even medium-sized social groups. So this is Matt Ridley. Actually, this is Matt Ridley about 20 years ago. Matt Ridley is an Oxford PhD. He was a former science writer for The Economist and The Daily Telegraph. He's a businessman. For our purposes, the important things about Matt Ridley, besides the fact that he's pretty good at laying out complex ideas in an understandable fashion, is that he's a libertarian. So he's very sympathetic to capitalism, egoism, views about the nature of ethics and morality that depend on individual choice. And what he's going to be suggesting in this paper is that it is always rational from a subjectively self-interested position to engage in cooperation. Now, it's not always rational, but he's going to suggest that we have an understanding now of how even egoists are going to want to engage in cooperative behaviors for their own benefit. Now, you might remember the discussion that Rachel's had about that third argument for egoism. That argument that suggested that ethical egoism can explain all sorts of behaviors that are cooperative in nature. This is a sort of more empirically based version of that kind of argument. And we'll see that it is fairly successful in certain circumstances, but it also suffers the defects that Rachel points out in his analysis of that argument in the egoism chapter. So in the chapters that we're looking at, Ridley wants to discuss developments in what's called game theory. Specifically, he's interested in the extent to which thinking about relatively simple games can help theorists to understand how cooperative behavior can emerge in human societies. Now, it's important to realize that the sort of cooperative behavior that we're discussing here is really relatively limited. Human beings are the single most socially cooperative species in existence. We're the only species, probably, that you can gather together, say, 60,000 people of reproductive age, put them together in a stadium, and even though they don't know each other, they don't, usually anyway, break out into a bunch of fights. We can cooperatively sit 300 people, strangers of reproductive age, on a plane and take them up in this hollow metal tube 20 or 30,000 feet and land them again without any trouble. Human beings are the only species where you see this kind of ability to interact with strangers of breeding age. And so the sorts of cooperation that Ridley discusses here is really kind of superficial in comparison to the sort of cooperative and in general social behavior that we see from human beings overall. Oops. So this gentleman here is John von Neumann. Now, he's a Hungarian genius. There's no doubt about that. He was born in Hungary. He moved to the United States in 1929 when he was offered a permanent position at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Studies, and he stayed there. And he's credited with a number of things. He made contributions to statistics, he made contributions to economics, he made contributions to computation theory, to algorithm development. He was a polymath. And he's also often credited as the inventor of what we think of as modern game theory. And in 1944, he published this book together with a colleague of his, Oscar Morgenstern, that is called Theory of Games and Economic Behavior. And this book extends work that he had done earlier on choice strategies in interactive situations. And if you know anything about economics, if you're geeky this way, von Neumann was the one who discovered and proved theorems about maxi-min, which is a decision strategy in economics. The point of game theory is to find simplified versions of the world in which you can explore how agents who adopt particular strategies for interacting with people are going to interact, whether or not they're going to be successful, unsuccessful, why and when they'll be successful, and so on. And this was an area of study that had been done in spotty ways throughout a lot of modern European history. However, it wasn't until around 1944 that we start to see theorists focus on this as a discipline, a domain that they want to study and prove theorems devote time to.